So now let's invite uh, Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott will give us an a session about the track and trace in USA. The track and trace there system there is called DSCSA. Mr. Scott, he is a principal of Jennason. Mr. Jennason, Mr. Scott, please unmute yourself and start your session, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you to the TraceHub team for having me here. Let me get my screen shared. You let me know if you're able to see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, good. Well, again, I again want to say my appreciation as well for having me as part of this community and on this forum today. Look forward to speaking to this group about U.S. DSCSA regulation. What I primarily want to focus on in these next 15 minutes, obviously we'll talk a little bit about just the core concepts of the DSCSA regulation, the path that the industry has taken in the US to reach compliance with DSCSA, and then also make sure we're taking some time towards the end to focus on, now that we have passed pretty much most of the major milestones for enforcement with DSCSA, what should companies really be focusing on next? Do just another brief background introduction. Again, don't have to say too much more. Again, 18 years in the pharma sterilization space, most of it in a consulting capacity. Currently operate through my company Jennason, which we started in 2013. So about 13 years there, primarily helping companies really can be anywhere from initial education strategy, vendor selection, system implementation, and then ongoing support. And Jennason also has a small portfolio of software tools and solutions as well. So let's get into some of the background of the DSCSA regulation to start. So the law itself was passed back in 2013. It laid out a 10-year roadmap for full implementation with a number of phased milestones along the way. So the intention was to kind of slowly introduce the key concepts of what the regulation required over those 10 years, ending with what you would probably argue, and we could now safely say was probably the most ambitious of all the milestones of the law, which was requiring full end-to-end traceability. So from the time of finished good packaging at a manufacturer through distribution at wholesale distributors, ultimately to distribution to dispensers and pharmacies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of mechanism of the regulation. I think some other just kind of key concepts and characteristics of the regulation itself. So it requires 2D data matrix barcodes at what they'll call the lowest sellable unit level. It then requires 1D or 2D barcodes at what's known as the homogeneous case level. Aggregation, while not explicitly required by DSCSA, is effectively an implied requirement, primarily to support just the operational efficiency of supply chain operations. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about the fact that the DSCSA is what's known as a track and trace model, and how that has impacts on the data exchange, and why aggregation is effectively a necessity. And so as part of being a track and trace model, what DSCSA requires from a data standpoint is effectively every time that there is a transaction or a change of ownership of commercial prescription drugs in the US, there needs to be a corresponding exchange of data with the physical product. So as it moves from manufacturer to wholesaler, there's an exchange of data that essentially tells the purchaser of the product the serial numbers that are associated to that particular shipment or sale. And that process, again, repeats itself from manufacturer to wholesalers, and then again from wholesalers down to pharmacies and dispensers. And we'll get into a little bit more detail around that. There's some other aspects of the DSCSA regulation. One known as the authorized trading partners, so essentially some requirements that are part of the law to ensure that entities within the US supply chain are only transacting with what are referred to as authorized trading partners, basically entities that have the proper licensing to be playing their role, whether they're a manufacturer, distributor, dispenser within the supply chain. There's also requirements within DSCSA around verification and tracing. What this is essentially mechanisms that allow, could be trading partners with the industry, could also be regulatory agencies, gives them the ability to ask questions, typically back to the manufacturers, as to the legitimacy of a particular serialized unit. And so part of what the regulation requires, and really a very key part of what the regulation requires, is everybody across the industry must have the documented procedures in place to be able to make and also respond to, in the case of manufacturers, be able to respond to those types of verification requests or product tracing requests. I'd mentioned, there's basically the law laid out kind of a phased milestone over the 10-year period. There were a number of delays that occurred throughout a number of the different interim milestones during those 10 years. That was also true for the last major milestone of the law, as I mentioned, which was requiring that full end-to-end exchange of traceability data. So as again, it moved from manufacturer to wholesaler all the way down to dispenser, there had to be the exchange of data at each hop along the process. That was originally supposed to go into effect in 2023. Again, it was a 10-year roadmap from when the law was passed in 2013. But because of delays and other what were called FDA exemption periods, those milestones within the regulation really just went live last year. So there was a series of milestones. One was in May for manufacturers, repackagers, August for distributors, and November of 2025 for large dispensers, which were essentially then the final dates where then enforcement started across the industry. There's one segment that is still technically under FDA exemption, that's small dispensers. That exemption expires at the end of this year. So by November of this year, again, all segments of all sizes will be under full enforcement of DSCSA. And so really now the industry is in that mode, right, where we're still kind of technically within that first year after enforcement went into effect. And so that's where obviously you would expect a lot of, I think, learnings to come out. I think a lot of maybe challenges that weren't experienced when enforcement wasn't in place. Those are the types of things that I think a lot in the industry have been going through the past year and continue to go through. And because of that, right, I think it starts to paint a picture of, what should the industry really be focusing on next. There are two, I think, very key characteristics of DSCSA that maybe make some aspects of compliance a bit more complex than other global regulations we see. And I definitely don't say that in a positive way. As I mentioned, it's a track and trace model, right? So there's the expectation that there is tracking of the goods through all segments of the supply chain, manufacturer to wholesaler to dispenser. But then you combine that with an approach taken by the US to not leverage a centralized database of any type like we do see in many other countries. And again, this is the part I don't necessarily say that may be a positive for the US. I think the combination of these two things, right, being a track and trace model, but not leveraging a centralized database, what that means is that the full responsibility of the data exchange lies with the participants in the supply chain themselves, right? And so if I'm a manufacturer and I'm producing and serializing the finished goods, and I now go and sell it to my customers, if I have 50 customers that I might sell my product to, I need to make sure I've established the ability to exchange the serialized data that's required by DSCSA with all of those 50 customers, so that anytime, again, I sell them product, there's a change of ownership of product to that customer, the corresponding data exchange can happen. So I think because you have, again, you don't have the centralized database concept, basically the US industry had to go off and establish all of these point-to-point connections, which, as you can imagine, just exponentially increases the points of failure and the possibility for things to go wrong. And that data exchange part is really the core concept of DSCSA, because if for some reason, again, I'll use the scenario if I'm a manufacturer, if my data exchange either just doesn't occur to my downstream customer, or if the accuracy of that data that I share with my downstream customer doesn't exactly match the physical product that they receive, then by law, they're not supposed to take ownership of those goods. So what that creates in the US is what's usually referred to as DSCSA exceptions or exceptions management, because there is a constant need, right, for all entities within the supply chain to make sure that these data exchanges are happening on a daily basis. Because again, if they don't, it has a high likelihood of leading to some kind of supply disruption or product disruption, which in turn, as you can imagine, can also then quite quickly lead to some pretty significant financial impacts. And so again, I think that's really where now the industry is trying to figure out where their priorities and where their focus should be, as we are now in sort of the post-enforcement phase of the regulation. It's really this past year, I would say, has really been the first time in the full 10 plus year history of DSCSA where companies recognize that if something didn't work with serialization within their organization, it was going to have real business consequences. Right? There's nothing that motivates companies more than starting to see actual impacts to their bottom line because of serialization issues. Not performing well in constantly gating data to your trading partners can now have impacts on your downstream partners, potentially, taking business away from you. Costs can increase if shipments have to constantly be returned back to the seller, right, because of DSCSA or serialization issues. So there's real financial impact, right, that these companies are now experiencing, right, anytime something goes wrong within their serialization processes or within their serialization systems. And so I think as we look, let's say over the next few years in the US and where a lot of companies are going to spend their time and their focus and priority, there's always been, I think, this struggle between this concept of we need to be able to find value beyond compliance, right? That term has been around for many, many years at this point, certainly in the US. And with the hopes of, what are the ways that I'm going to now be able to use all the serialization data I'm gathering for other non-compliance reasons, right? To try and just drive value out of this data. And there absolutely, I think, have been, I'll say isolated use cases where companies have been able to find and leverage the serialization data to find, again, non-compliance benefits to it. Typically, it would be things looking within their four walls, maybe ways to improve processes or operations. But I think where really the industry should be focusing most of their time and attention is, now that we are past enforcement, how do I make sure that I am able to support my DSCSA operations, again, on a daily basis in the most efficient way possible, in the leanest way possible, and for the lowest cost, as possible? Because I think there's a much greater segment of the industry in the US, a lot more companies participating in the US supply chain that have very real opportunities to become much more efficient, lean, and lower their cost, just in terms of what's needed to support, DSCSA operations on a daily basis. And so if I look at my experience of all the companies that I've supported in the US and helping them become compliant with DSCSA, the companies that I feel, or I would consider to be, call it the highest performers, right? Those that are not only just being compliant with the laws themselves, but also able to do that, again, in the most efficient way, in the most lean ways possible. I really can find two common characteristics among those companies. First and foremost is they pick the right core serialization systems. We often refer to them as L4, L5 serialization platforms. That, again, in my experience, as I support many entities across the industry, there's clear trends between if you pick the right systems, you at least have the better opportunities to, again, become very efficient and lean in supporting your DSCSA operations. So making sure you have the right foundational systems is number one on the list. And number two on the list is making a commitment to train your internal resources, right? So that when the time comes, you don't have to have long-term dependencies on external resources, right? Or external teams just to help you manage DSCSA compliance on a daily basis. And I say that very much knowing, right? I am one of those external resources, right? I am a consultant that helps companies in this space. But my goal, and what I've seen that is very achievable for many companies in the US, is it is absolutely possible, to go through their whole serialization journey from education, picking systems, implementing those systems, to then after a go live period, absolutely being able to become self-sufficient in managing their operations without the need for long-term dependency again on folks like myself. And that's how I start engagements with all of my clients, right? I say, my goal is to eventually get you to the point where you don't need me anymore. And I think there's just a lot of education that can still be done across the industry on the US to show that that is absolutely achievable and possible. And, just that happens through sharing use cases and examples of companies who were able to kind of reach that point of self-sufficiency. There's really, I think, two key things. This is the last point I'll kind of end on. There's really two key things that I think are allowing companies to reach that, ability to be self-sufficient in managing their DSCSA operations on a daily basis. That probably only came about within the last year, a couple years at this point. The first is that we need to change what I consider misperception number one. We need to change that mentality that the full set of serialization capabilities that I may need within my organization, I can only get from my one L4, L5 provider. So if I need a certain service or solution or capability, I have to hope that my current provider offers that. If they don't, I might be a bit out of luck, or they might, go off and try to build something, but I'm effectively limited to that provider. Again, companies that I see being best positioned not only for compliance, but long-term efficient and lean support are leveraging L4, L5 systems that are open and extensible, and in fact encourage the ability for third-party tools and solutions to be layered on top to extend the capabilities of L4, L5 systems, right? So that the customer themselves doesn't feel locked in to that single vendor approach. And we have those tools now today. Again, I think for really the first time, where we're starting to see the ability to introduce automation in many different ways. So in DSCSA, the main ways where I think automation is making a huge difference is the ability to just constantly be monitoring your batch operations. So as batches are being packaged, you're doing real-time reconciliation of those batches against the serialization data that was captured for those batches. And then the same kind of concepts for outbound shipments to customers. So every time you sell product to a customer or downstream entity, you're able to have the real-time, monitoring and reconciliation that the serialization data that you're now having to exchange with those downstream entities every time you sell product, that serialization data exactly matches what was said to have been physically shipped in that particular shipment, right? I think that's kind of become now the baseline for what really any entity within the US supply chain should strive to have in order to really have, again, efficient and lean operations. And then the second thing I'll end with quickly, right, again, is just, I think, a misperception that is important for entities in the US to focus on is there's always been this historical mindset, I think, right, that it took so much time, it took so much money to implement my serialization system the first time. Even if I'm having challenges with that system, there's no way that I want to go through that experience again. And that can be understandable, right? Because I think in the earlier days, it was, much more costly and much more timely to implement serialization platforms. That's completely shifted now, right? To where now it's never been easier if you are having challenges or concerns about the strategic long-term fit of your current providers. It's never been easier to feasibly consider alternative options, right? I think, again, for the first time ever, we have purpose-built tools that can actually help companies move from legacy serialization systems to new platforms. And I think that opens up and really unlocks a lot of opportunities, again, for companies who take the time to sort of reassess the foundation of their serialization capabilities and how they're able to support DSCSA compliance. And if they feel one of the key changes they need to make, right, is to look at alternative foundational L4, L5 systems, it's never been more achievable, right, to be able to move to those new platforms, again, within timeframes, you know, without having to spend ridiculous amounts of money, and most importantly, be able to do it without disrupting operations that obviously have to continue on a daily basis. So I think those are two things that the industry will continue to evolve around. And I think that's going to be what a big focus for companies distributing into the US is going to be going forward. With that, Ahmed, I'll hand it back to you if there's any questions.
We supposed to meet before, Mr. Scott, I think, many times. So I am lucky to have this discussion today in this webinar. As I mentioned in info session with Mr. Charles also, and I mentioned many times for Justin, this is the value to have a discussion between different countries, which is applying track and trace in different models. Info is applying verification, Egypt and the Middle East applying traceability, America, USA will apply a decentralized model, Middle Eastern and the African countries is applying centralized model. This is the way which is every country have its own perspective to implement the track and trace with the way that is fit the market and achieve what is needed from the authority, and from the market, of course. I think Mr. Udit, do you have a question?
Hi, Scott. Good to see you. Long time, indeed.
Yes.
Hey, so quick question. What happened to VRS?
It's a good question. I mean, VRS is still active, and so just to give context, so one of the requirements I mentioned as part of the DSCSA regulation is this ability for entities to make product verification requests and then a responsibility for manufacturers to be able to respond to those verification requests in a timely fashion as well. And one of the mechanisms the industry came up with to address that requirement within a DSCSA was this service or solution known as VRS. So the first thing I always say, just for the broader audience, right, is VRS itself is not a DSCSA requirement, right? The requirement is you have to have the ability to make and respond to verification requests. And again, VRS was just one of the, let's call it systematic or automated ways that the industry came up with, really to help, you know, more of the major and larger volume players be able to just handle the volume of verification requests that they were expecting. So VRS is still very much alive and in place and being leveraged. You know, you may not see it leveraged, or you may not see as much focus on it as there was previously, because one of the big changes now that we have passed the final milestones of DSCSA is that now it's required for the EPCIS, the serialization data, to be exchanged right at each hop along the process. I think that really cut into a lot of the scenarios where companies were needing to make verification requests back to manufacturers because that EPCIS data wasn't yet being exchanged, you know, down the full through all the different segments. So it's still very much in place. It is leveraged. You know, my position is what I typically say to my clients is, if you have a very clear business use case for VRS, meaning you receive enough verification requests on a daily basis that you think it's not feasible to manage manually, then a VRS service might make sense to you. At the same time, I think there are many organizations out there that have probably been paying for VRS service, and they might find that they're getting no verification request, or 1, 2, 3 a week, you know, very small volumes. And I think that's where, again, it can just be a decision if there's really a business case to have VRS in that kind of situation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Scott.
Mr. Scott, Thanks a lot for your time, for your valuable session. It was very good to have you in the webinar, because we need to know all the status about the track and trace in different countries. It is very important to have an eye on what happened in DSCSA and USA. So thanks a lot for your time, and I think we will meet again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's now we will move to the next session.